So, hello there. Today we are currently in Christophany Walled Garden, and we're not specifically doing this walled garden. Today, this episode is going to be about walled gardens in general. Now, this specific walled garden isn't that historic. When it was abandoned by its estate, it was converted into this rather lovely little volunteer-run community garden. It's a little bit dead now because it's winter, but it's still quite nice. Now, walled gardens in themselves are a really interesting piece of estate history. I used to do research work for the National Trust for Scotland, specifically for the Gardens and Designed Landscapes Department, and literally every single big house in the National Trust portfolio had some sort of walled garden somewhere in its history. And the reasons for that are quite obvious, you know. There weren't any supermarkets and many of these estates were quite remote. So if you wanted to provide fresh fruit and veg and produce for the big house, you have to grow it on the estate. And what better way to grow it in a protected walled garden, protected from some of the elements and from pests and wild animals. Now, the first walled gardens emerged in the early modern periods, and in the early modern period they were quite practical structures. They were there basically to grow fruit and veg for the big house. But in the 18th century, it got a little bit fancier. A fashion for showing off what you can do on your estate and showing off to your neighbours and your friends, came about. And the walled garden not only became a centre for produce, but also a centre to show off. So you'd have walled gardens that, alongside fruit and veg, grew hard to grow flowers and plants and imported specimens and stuff like that. Even its original purpose, growing fruit and veg, became a sort of showboating opportunity. In the 18th century, pineapples and oranges were quite hard to grow. So if you could grow one of those, it showed off your status as a great estate owner. In fact, pineapples in themselves have a very interesting history. In the 18th century, they were incredibly expensive. They were luxury items. In fact, some people would actually rent out pineapples as sort of centerpieces for great dinners at middle class and upper class houses. So if you could grow a pineapple on your estate, then you'd be sort of the wealthiest of the wealthiest. It would be a bit like owning a Ferrari factory or something. There's also a reason why the National Trust for Scotland owns a summer house in a walled garden with a giant pineapple on the top of it. It's called a pineapple. It's near Earth. I'll probably put a What Few Words location just down there. I highly recommend you look at pictures of it. It is very, very strange. Now, in the later 18th century, a trend of Romanticism, the Romantic movement, came about. So out came this sort of highly controlled, highly processed showboat gardens, and in came natural-looking parklands and estates and forests, because that nature was romantic. As a result, walled gardens sort of went from being these big showboaty camp things to, back to their original purpose, growing fruit and veg for the big house. And it's during this time that you actually start to see some of the walled gardens start to disappear, because, you don't want this big, massive edifice in the middle of your beautiful natural parkland. You want it hidden away, round the back where nobody would see it, because it's a practical thing for practical people, to grow fruit and veg in. Now, in the later half of the 19th century, right up to about the Second World War, walled gardens sort of came back into vogue. Today, the traditional image of the walled garden is very, very much Victorian, with its sort of glass house to grow, tropical fruits like vines and oranges. Orangeries were quite a big part of walled gardens around this time. But also, again, they became decorative again. You often have one half the walled garden for fruit and veg, and the other half, just as a sort of pretty show garden. But the walled garden really started to die out just after the Second World War. The great big estates that once relied on, lots and lots of workers and staff, started to die away, because frankly they couldn't get the staff. So they had to scale back, and one of the things that they scaled back on was the walled garden, because now you could go down to your local shop in the village and get your supplies. Or you could write to your local wholesaler and order, so and so amount of apples, so and so amount of potatoes, so and so amount, of herbs and stuff like that. So the need for the walled garden sort of died away. And this resulted in a lot of abandoned walled gardens. And abandoned walled garden spotting is quite an interesting thing to do. They're really easy to spot on old maps and, aerial photographs. In fact, there's a abandoned walled garden somewhere over in that direction. But there's also an abandoned walled garden over that direction in Camo. In fact, if you go just exploring Google Maps and you find a sort of random square structure in what seems to be an old estate, chances are that used to be a walled garden. So that's your homework for today. Go onto Google Maps or to maps.nls.uk and try and find some abandoned walled gardens. Have fun!